All right, so buckle up, everyone, because today we're diving headfirst into some really big, kind of scary questions about where the world's headed.
Yeah, no sugarcoating here.
We're using Doug Casey's latest work as our guide, and he's basically saying,
Well, he's saying we're in the most dangerous period since World War II.
no small claim, right?
Yeah.
So how do we even begin to unpack that?
Well, I think the first thing is to look at what he sees as the biggest threat, which is...
The rising tensions between, well, pretty much all the major global players.
Right, you've got the U.S., Russia, China, Iran, all these competing powers with conflicting interests.
And it feels like any one of these conflicts, like we're seeing with Russia and Ukraine, could
Really
easily
kind of-
escalate.
Yeah, and that's what Casey's warning about, right?
Yeah.
It's like the world's a tinderbox right now.
Exactly. He's drawing parallels to historical events like the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, which, on the surface seemed like an isolated incident.
But it triggered a chain reaction.
Mhm.
It triggered World War I. So his point is that in today's interconnected world, even a small spark could ignite a global conflict.
Especially when you factor in, well, nuclear weapons.
Right. The stakes are unbelievably high.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about another big issue Casey highlights, which is the U.S. national debt.
Yeah.
Over $30 trillion. I mean, I can't even wrap my head around a number that big.
It's astronomical. I mean,
Ugh.
think of it this way. Imagine maxing out all your credit codes, right? Just racking up debt and only making the minimum payments.
Ooh, yeah, not a good feeling.
No, not at all. And that's kind of what Casey's saying is happening on a national level, just on a much grander scale.
And eventually, something's got to give, right?
That's his warning. He believes this level of debt is totally unsustainable, and it's going to lead to what he calls the Greater Depression.
So basically, an economic downturn that makes the 1930s look like a walk in the park.
That's the idea, yeah. But here's the thing, and maybe this is where it gets a little confusing. The stock market seems to be doing pretty well.
Right. So shouldn't that be reflecting these underlying problems? If everything's so bad, how are stocks still going up?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's something Casey addresses head-on. He basically argues that the stock market's a mirage, a bubble that's being artificially inflated. He points to things like the Shiller P/E ratio.
Which is?
It's a way of measuring stock prices against long-term earnings, and right now, it's flashing some major warning signs.
So for those of us who, aren't financial experts, what does this actually mean? Like, should we be worried about our retirement accounts, our investments?
It's definitely a cause for concern. Casey's point is that this disconnect between the stock market and the real economy can't last forever. At some point, that bubble's going to burst.
Okay, so we've got geopolitical tensions, a mountain of debt, and a potentially overinflated stock market. I mean, where do we even begin to make sense of all this?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. Casey doesn't just point out the problems. He actually offers some solutions.
All right, so let's hear him. What does he propose we do about this impending global crisis?
Well, hold on tight because some of his ideas are pretty radical.
Ah,
Buckle up because we're about to get into some really controversial territory with Doug Casey's proposed solutions.
yeah, I mean, we're talking radical change, right? Like starting with his idea of slashing government spending.
Oh, yeah. And he's not talking about just trimming the edges here. He wants to fundamentally shrink the size and scope of government.
But how? I mean, where does he even begin?
Well, he takes aim at a lot of different areas, but one of his biggest targets is the Department of Education.
Wait, he wants to get rid of the entire Department of Education.
Eliminate it completely. Gone. His argument is that education should be decentralized, driven by individual choice, not government mandates.
So basically, no more public schools.
Not exactly. He envisions a system where funding follows the student.
So like vouchers.
Exactly. Parents and students would have the power to choose the educational options that work best for them.
I mean, it sounds good in theory, but what about, families who can't afford private schools or alternative options? Wouldn't that leave a lot of kids behind?
That's a valid concern, and it's one of the most common criticisms of Casey's approach. His counterargument is that with a smaller government role, you'd have more resources available for alternative funding mechanisms, like scholarships, for example.
Okay, so less government, more individual choice in education. Got it. What else is on his chopping block?
Basically, he wants to see significant cuts across the board to pretty much every government program and agency. His philosophy is that the free market, not the government, is the best way to drive progress.
So smaller government, and I'm guessing lower taxes too?
Big time. He's a huge proponent of tax cuts. He argues that high taxes stifle investment and entrepreneurship. He wants to see the tax code simplified and the overall burden on individuals and businesses reduced.
It all sounds very libertarian, very free market. But is it realistic? I mean, aren't there certain things that only the government can effectively provide, like, infrastructure?
Or social safety nets.
Yeah, exactly.
These are important questions, and they're at the heart of the debate around Casey's ideas. Critics argue that such drastic cuts could lead to a decline in essential services and make inequality even worse.
It's a tough one, right? Finding that balance between government involvement and individual freedom.
Absolutely. It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
Okay, so we've talked about slashing government spending and taxes. What about trade? I know Casey has some pretty strong opinions on trade wars.
He does. He's very concerned about the impact of high tariffs. He thinks they could set off a chain reaction of retaliatory measures.
And ultimately lead to a collapse of global trade.
Exactly. He actually compares it to the Smoot-Hawley tariffs of the 1930s, which, a lot of people believe made the Great Depression even worse.
So he's saying we're making the same mistakes all over again.
That's the warning he's sounding. He believes protectionist policies ultimately hurt everyone. They lead to higher prices for consumers, less access to goods and services, and overall economic decline.
Okay, so instead of trying to protect our own industries, he's saying we should be embracing free trade.
Exactly. He sees it as a win-win for everyone involved. Countries can specialize in what they do best, and we create a more efficient global economy.
But what about all the jobs that are lost when companies move production overseas to places with lower wages?
He acknowledges that concern. But he argues that the long-term benefits of free trade outweigh those short-term disruptions. He believes that ultimately free trade leads to more innovation, more entrepreneurship, and in the long run, better jobs and more prosperity for everyone.
I see. So it's a long game, not a quick fix.
Right. And it requires a certain amount of faith in the power of the free market to sort things out.
Which brings us to another interesting aspect of Casey's analysis. The rise of, what are they called, the BRICS nations.
Right. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa.
Yeah. I've heard a lot about them lately, but how do they fit into all of this?
Well, Casey believes that the U.S. dollar's dominance is fading, and the BRICS nations are playing a key role in that shift. They're doing more and more trade with each other using their own currencies.
So they're kind of bypassing the dollar.
Exactly. And that's a direct challenge to the existing global financial order.
What does that mean for the U.S.? I mean, is Casey predicting a decline in American power?
He's definitely suggesting that the world is becoming more multipolar, with power shifting away from the U.S. He believes the BRICS nations and other emerging economies are going to have a much bigger say in how things work going forward.
Okay, so that's the big picture, but what about us, the average person? How does all of this actually affect our daily lives?
It could manifest in a lot of different ways. We might see changes in exchange rates, which would affect the cost of imported goods. Or we might see shifts in global supply chains, which could lead to shortages or price fluctuations.
It's crazy to think about how these global trends can have such a direct impact on our wallets.
Yeah. And it really highlights how interconnected our world is. What happens in one part of the globe can ripple out and affect us all.
So we've talked about the doom and gloom, the potential for economic collapse, trade wars, shifting global power dynamics. It's a lot to take in. But what about the upside? I mean, where does Casey see opportunities in all of this?
Well, he's a contrarian investor, which means he often looks for opportunities where others see only risk.
So he's looking for the silver lining in the storm cloud.
Exactly. And he believes that understanding the underlying trends and cycles of the market is key to making smart investment decisions, especially in times of upheaval.
So where's he putting his money?
But one area he's particularly bullish on is energy, specifically oil and gas.
Really? A lot of people are saying fossil fuels are on their way out.
He acknowledges the growth of renewables, but he doesn't think the transition is going to happen as quickly as some people predict. He sees continued demand for oil and gas, especially in developing countries, and he thinks well-managed energy companies could offer significant returns.
Okay, so oil and gas. What else?
Another area he's been recommending for years is precious metals, particularly gold. He sees gold as a safe haven asset, something that holds its value during times of economic uncertainty and inflation.
So gold is like the classic hedge against a potential crash.
Exactly. It can help protect your portfolio from losses in other areas like stocks or bonds.
Okay, got it. Energy and gold. Anything else catching his eye?
One that might surprise you? Uranium.
Uranium. What's the play there?
He thinks it's an undervalued asset with huge growth potential. He's betting on a resurgence of nuclear energy, driven by the need for cleaner, more reliable power sources.
Interesting. So he's not afraid to go against the grain.
Not at all. He does his own research, forms his own opinions, and isn't afraid to bet on things that others might see as risky.
I admire that. But for those of us who aren't, high-rolling investors, are there any takeaways from his philosophy that we can apply to our own financial planning?
Absolutely. The biggest one is to do your research. Don't just follow the herd or chase the latest hot stock tip. Think critically and consider a variety of perspectives before making any investment decisions.
So basically, educate yourself. Don't just blindly trust what you hear.
Right. And that brings us to another area where Casey's ideas are pretty radical. His vision for a revolution in education.
Let's talk about that. All right, so let's dig into this education revolution that Casey keeps talking about. I mean, he's really passionate about this.
Yeah, you can tell this is something he feels strongly about. It all goes back to his belief that the traditional education system is, well, basically obsolete.
Okay, but how do we even begin to fix a system that's, been around for centuries?
Casey's answer is simple. We don't fix it, we replace it. He envisions a future where self-learning is the primary mode of education, not just some, alternative thing.
And he thinks technology is the key to making that happen.
Absolutely. He points to online courses, educational videos, all these interactive platforms that are already out there.
I mean, yeah, those are definitely becoming more popular, but I'm not sure I'm ready to ditch traditional schools altogether.
Well, he's not necessarily saying we have to abandon everything overnight, but he does believe that these technologies are already starting to disrupt the traditional model. They're making learning more accessible, more affordable, and more personalized.
Okay, I can see that. But what about, the social aspect of school? Kids learn a lot from interacting with each other, with their teachers.
That's a good point. And it's something that Casey acknowledges. He's not suggesting that we isolate ourselves and learn entirely in a vacuum, but he does believe that the current system puts too much emphasis on, well, on conformity and standardization.
Okay, I get that. I mean, it's not like everyone learns at the same pace or in the same way.
Exactly. And that's where he sees the potential for self-learning to really shine. It allows individuals to customize their learning journey, to focus on their strengths, to explore their passions. He believes it would lead to a more engaged, more motivated, and ultimately more successful workforce.
It's a bold vision, no doubt about it. I guess only time will tell if it actually comes to fruition. But I think his insights definitely challenge us to rethink some of our assumptions about education.
I agree. It's about opening our minds to new possibilities, to different ways of learning and growing. And I think that's a message that resonates beyond just education. It applies to every aspect of our lives.
I like that. So as we wrap up this deep dive into Doug Casey's, his rather provocative worldview, is there one key takeaway, one big idea that you hope our listeners will walk away with?
That's a tough one. I mean, there's so much to unpack here, but I guess if I had to choose one thing, it would be this. Don't be afraid to challenge the status quo. Don't just blindly accept what you're told. Do your own research, think critically, and be open to new ideas.
Well said. And in a world that's changing as rapidly as ours, that ability to think for yourself, to adapt, and to keep learning is more important than ever.
Couldn't agree more.
Well, that's about all the time we have for today, but I want to thank you, and I want to thank everyone listening for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep questioning everything.